Welcome to this analysis on Laura Mulvey's influential essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. This essay represents a high watermark in film theory. Laura Mulvey discusses the psychoanalytic concept of scopophilia with reference to the 20th century Hollywood films. Influenced by the ideas of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, she views scopophilia through a phallocentric, heteronormative lens. In her essay, she utilizes psychoanalysis theory as a political weapon to demonstrate how the patriarchic subconscious of society shapes our film-watching experience and cinema itself. The psychoanalytic perspective provides the link between the cinematic text and the viewer and explains his fascination through the way cinematic representations interact with his culturally determined subconscious. For Mulvey, patriarchy and phallocentrism in all its manifestations depends upon the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world. Woman's desire is subjected to her image as bearer of the bleeding wound. She can exist only in relation to castration and cannot transcend it. The woman's lack of a phallus gives meaning to the man's possession of such and the power and the status it brings. This process is both displayed and reinforced in the cinema. The cinematic gaze is always produced as masculine by means of the identification produced with the male hero and through the use of camera. Mulvey's main argument in this essay is that Hollywood narrative films use women in order to provide a pleasurable visual experience for men. The narrative film structures its gaze as masculine. The woman is always the subject of reifying gaze, not the bearer of it. This is something reminiscent of John Berger's ways of seeing. According to Mulvey, the cinematic text is organized along lines that are corresponding to the cultural subconscious, which is essentially patriarchic. Mulvey argues that the popularity of Hollywood films is determined and reinforced by pre-existing social patterns which have shaped the fascinated subject. According to Mulvey, Freud associated scopophilia with taking other people as objects, subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze. To Mulvey, however, something more is at work: oppressive gendering and patriarchal control. She characterizes scopophilia as essentially active, a state in which the controlling male gaze objectifies and limits the passive woman on the screen. Woman stands in patriarchal culture as signifier for the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions. Women is restricted to their role as the bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. Through scopophilia, therefore, mainstream film coded the erotic into the language of the dominant patriarchal order. This type of pleasure, as Mulvey understands it, is a tool heterosexual men use to control and harm heterosexual women. Cinema, according to Mulvey, affords two forms of pleasure: scopophilia, the erotic voyeuristic pleasure of subjecting others to a controlling and curious gaze, and which is associated with the libido; and the second one, the narcissistic pleasure of identification with the male protagonist or the camera's point of view, which Mulvey associates with the mirror face of Jacques Lacan's psychology. The moment that the child misrecognizes himself with his own reflection, thereby constituting his ego. Lacan's theory. Both mechanisms represent the mental desires of the male subject. The first form of pleasure relates to what Freud termed the scopophilia, or the pleasure derived from subjecting someone to one's gaze. The second form of pleasure, other which operates alongside the scopophilia, is the identification with the represented character, which is brought about by needs stemming from the Freudian hero. Both mechanisms discussed in the previous session are gendered according to Mulvey. Scopophilia in films is a structure which functions on an axis of passive actor, with the man always on the active gazing side and the woman on the passive to be looked atness side. This is done in two completing manners, with both the male figure within the dais and the camera looking at the woman and directing the viewer's objectifying gaze. In plain words, the woman in the films is meant to be looked at. The distinction between the passive woman and active man is also manifested in the structure of the cinematic narrative. The films Mulvey surveys revolve around a dominant male figure with which the viewer can identify. This identification is similar to Lacan's mirror stage, in which the narcissistic, fragmented subject experiences himself a whole and potent in a reflected self-image. Methods that produce cinematic realism aid in this mirror-like identification, which reinforces the ego. According to Mulvey, the female cinematic figure is a paradoxical one. She combines attraction with the playing on deep fears of castration. The male subconscious has two ways of escaping his fear of castration. One is the demystification of the female figure, that is, the dismantling of her mysteries. In films, the female figure is punished or saved by the male figure. The other way to escape the fear of being castrated by the woman is through the fetishization of her, for instance, as the glamorous, unobtainable star. Films, according to Mulvey, attempt to resolve the tension between being attracted to the woman and fearing her, and therefore they provide for the needs of the masculine form of desire. The female body exists for the pleasure of the male gaze. However, since the female form has no phallus, it is identified with the threat of castration, and the spectator resorts to either the sadistic, voyeuristic pleasure in the spectacle of punishment of women, the bearers of guilt who, being castrated, must have done something to deserve it, or disavowal of the threat of castration through fetishism. This fetishism can take almost any form: extravagant set design, excessive camera movement, musical numbers, just about anything that can't be explained by sadistic voyeurism. In fact, meaning that Mulvey can claim to have explained the entire cinematic experience with a minimal number of psychoanalytical terms. Scopophilia for Mulvey is a very particular kind of perversion, a gendered perversion, you can say. Mulvey is invoking the populist lowest common denominator reaction, and this limits our understanding of narrative film. Mulvey's theory takes masculinity as normative in that the feminine as is defined in terms of deviation from the masculine, hence lack, absence, or otherness. For Mulvey, identification is always with the male point of view. Even for the female audience, and female characters are always subject to the controlling male gaze. Male protagonists and audiences are active. Female characters and spectators are considered passive. There is no room in Mulvey's essay for the pleasures of a female viewer other than masochism, and no room either for identification across gender and cultures offer identification for gay audience and so on. The male form cannot be subject to eroticization in the way that the female form can do. Since pleasure is identified purely with patriarchal domination, pleasure must be done away with. Mulvey advocates the destruction of pleasure as a radical weapon. Her essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, was criticized on the one hand for reinforcing heterosexuality and on the other hand for assuming a passive, unnegotiating viewer. Thank you.